the ICH E1 guidelines. So these guidelines mainly focus on the safety evaluation of the drugs which are meant for longer term treatment. So it also provides the basic principles for assessing the clinical safety trials in such cases. The key points of these guidelines is the first one is risk benefit balance. So the E2 guidelines. So these guidelines mainly focus on clinical safety reporting. It also guides the handling and reporting of adverse drug reactions during the investigational phase of the drug development. And it also provides a guidance on planning of pharmacovigilance activities, especially for early post-marketing period of new medicinal products. So it also covers the chemical entities, biotechnology derived products and vaccines. ICH E3 guidelines. It is about the creation of clinical study reports for human medicines. These guidelines facilitate the formation of single core study material or report that is acceptable by all the regulatory authorities. So the main purpose of these guidelines is to outline the essential components of the clinical study reports. It ensures the consistency across the different regions and helps to streamline the submission process also. The clinical study reports should cover various aspects including the study design, patient demographics, treatment details, efficacy, evaluation, safety assessment, statistical plan, and many more. The report typically includes the sections like synopsis, ethics, investigator information, study administrative structure, and a sample size determination. The main purpose of these guidelines is to get the dose response information during the time of drug development. Study design. ICH E4 describes the various clinical designs for assessing the dose response. These includes parallel dose response, means here we are comparing the different doses simultaneously. Crossover dose response, using the crossover design to evaluate the responses. Forced titration means adjusting the doses based on the predefined criteria. Optional titration, that is titration to an endpoint while considering the placebo effects. So these guidelines is mainly focus on facilitating the registration of the new drugs and biological products in the different countries of the world, and it also focus on what is the impact of ethnic factors on the effectiveness of the drug, means the different country people how they are going to respond towards the particular drug regarding its effectiveness, that is taken under consideration in these guidelines. ICH E6, it is also called as good clinical practice. The purpose of these guidelines is to provide an international ethical and scientific quality standard. It ensures the protection of participants who are involved in that clinical research. Then regarding E7 guidelines, so these guidelines mainly focus on the studies in support of some special category of populations like in elder peoples or in old peoples. The purpose of these guidelines is to ensure the clinical testing program which follow a harmonized guidelines based on ethical and scientific principles. So it addresses the unique considerations for medicines used in the elderly populations. The E9 guidelines, it is statistical principles for clinical trials. So it mainly deals regarding the sensitive analysis in the clinical trials. It provides an essential guidelines or guidance for clinical trial regarding its planning, conducting analysis and interpretation of the results. ICH E9 guidelines, which is titled as Statistical Principles for Clinical Trials. So it provides an essential guidance for clinical trial regarding the planning, conducting, analysis, and the interpretation of the results. Sensitivity analysis in clinical trials. So it shows how the results are get affected when the methods are changed. The main purpose is to strengthen and to establish a collaboration between the different disciplines which are involved in the clinical trial design. So it creates a strong bond between the study objectives, design, conduct, and analysis. The next one is ICH E10 guidelines. So it is titled as Choice of Control Groups in Clinical Trials. So it provides essential guidance in selecting the control groups in the clinical trials. Now, what are control groups? A control group is a group of participants in the clinical trials that they do not receive any experimental treatment. Instead of that, they receive a placebo. Now, what is placebo means? It is not a drug, but it resembles the drug and it does not have any pharmacological or therapeutic effect on the body. So this group serves as a baseline or acts as a baseline to compare the effects of the experimental treatment. Now the ICH E11 guidelines. The main objective of this guideline is to encourage and facilitate the development of pediatric medicinal products internationally. These guidelines mainly focus on critical issues and approaches for the safe, efficient, and ethical studies of the drugs which are used in the children. Age categories. The guidelines discuss age-specific considerations for pediatric drug development. Ethics. It focuses on ethical aspects related to the pediatric research. Formulation. Guidance on the development of the pediatric formulation. Pharmacokinetics. Considerations for the studying drug pharmacokinetics, especially in the children. The ICH E12 guidelines provides core principles for the clinical evaluation of new antihypertensive drugs. The main objective of these guidelines is to focus on evaluating the antihypertensive drugs in clinical trials. ICH 13 guidelines. The purpose of these guidelines is to provide a framework for planning and designing of MRCTs, that is multi-regional clinical trials. It ensures that the data obtained is acceptable for regulatory submission in the multiple regions, that is in the different countries of the world. So this will facilitate and help in global development of the new drugs. The ICH E14 guidelines. These guidelines is for the design, conduct, analysis and interpretation of the clinical studies in order to assess the potential of the drug that can delay the cardiac repolarization. The objective of these guidelines aims to evaluate the impact of the drugs on cardiac repolarization, which is important for assessing the safety of the drug about the cardiac health. On QT interval, a measure of cardiac repolarization. These studies involve ECG monitoring. Clinical evaluation. The guideline provides guidance on clinical trial design, endpoints, and safety assessment related to QT intervals prolongation. ICH E15 guidelines. So these guidelines provide definitions related to genomic biomarkers, pharmacogenomics, pharmacogenetics. Genomic biomarkers means a measurable DNA or a RNA characteristic that is an indicator of normal biological process, pathogenic process, and or a response to the therapeutic or other interventions. Pharmacogenomics means the study of how the genes of a person affect the response or give the response towards the drug. Pharmacogenetics means a branch of the pharmacology concerned with the effect of genetic factors on the reactions to the drugs.